My name is Laura. I am 53 years old and married to a wonderful man named Richard. We live in a beautiful house in Buffalo, New York. I work at Lush Gardens, which requires regular maintenance. Richard's job often takes him away on business trips, leaving me alone for days at a time. It was during these long, silent hours that I first noticed the gardener, Ryan. He was young, about 25, maybe 26 at most, with a toned and fit physique. His movements and the way his muscles flexed while trimming hedges or mowing the lawn were mesmerizing. There was something almost hypnotic about the way he worked, effortlessly handling heavy tools, and the way his sunlit skin glistened as if he were an artist shaping chaotic green lawns into perfect lines and curves. At first, I thought it was just harmless admiration, the daydream of a bored housewife. After all, who doesn't enjoy a little eye candy now and then? But as time passed, I found myself lingering by the window longer and longer, yearning to be closer to him. One day, on a whim, I decided to act. Pretending my husband was away on business, I felt a sudden surge of boldness. I waited until Ryan was working on the bushes near our house, then walked downstairs and out onto the porch. "Would you like something to drink?" I called out. He turned, startled, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. They were a warm, deep brown, like rich earth. "No, thank you, ma'am," he replied, a polite smile on his face. He was younger than I had thought. His hair was black and curly, damp with sweat, and his cheeks were flushed from exertion. "Please, call me Laura," I said, returning his smile. "And it's hot out here. I wouldn't want you fainting from heatstroke on my lawn." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, thank you. I'm Ryan, by the way." I went inside to pour him a glass of lemonade, my hands trembling slightly. What was I doing? This was madness. But I couldn't stop myself. I wanted to be near him, to talk to him, to know more about him. I handed him the glass, and he drank it gratefully. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed, and I watched a drop of lemonade trickle down his chin. He wiped it away with the back of his hand and grinned at me. "Thank you," he said, handing me the empty glass. "You're welcome. Would you like some more?" I asked, eager to prolong our interaction. He shook his head. "No, thank you. I should get back to work." I nodded, trying to hide my disappointment. "All right. But if you change your mind, let me know." It wasn't just that he was young and handsome, there was something about his gentleness, his quiet respectfulness, that drew me to him. I watched him as he worked, noticing how his gaze would drop whenever I looked directly at him, as if he couldn't hold eye contact. I liked that, his almost shy demeanor. His warm, genuine smile made my heart flutter. Back inside, my mind raced. I felt like a teenager again, giddy, nervous, and excited all at once. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced in decades, and it was intoxicating. From that day on, it became a little ritual. Whenever Richard was away, I'd invite Ryan for a drink or a snack, and we'd make small talk. He'd tell me about his love for gardening, a passion he'd learned from his grandfather, and I'd share stories from my youth, about travels and dreams that now felt like distant memories, but seemed to come alive again in his presence. Our conversations were friendly, even innocent, but there was an undercurrent of something more intense simmering just beneath the surface. One evening, after one of our chats, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror and was almost shocked by the woman staring back. My eyes sparkled in a way they hadn't in years, and my cheeks were flushed. I felt alive, energized by the possibility that perhaps, just maybe, this young man saw me as more than just a kind woman offering lemonade. But I knew it was wrong. I was married, for God's sake. I had children, a life, and a reputation to uphold. And he was so much younger than me. It was absurd, insane even. But I couldn't help myself, I was drawn to him, irresistibly so. Then Richard returned from his business trip, and everything changed. Ryan still came to tend the garden, but I could no longer invite him into the house. I had to be content with watching him from a distance, my heart aching with longing. When I discovered Richard's schedule had changed and he would be staying home more often, my frustration grew. I missed those small moments of connection with Ryan, the way his eyes lit up when he saw me, the thrill of wondering what might happen if I pushed the boundaries just a little further. One morning, as I watched Ryan from the window, I noticed a look of disappointment in his eyes. He glanced at the house, his gaze lingering for a moment before he turned back to his work. He must have thought I'd lost interest, that I no longer cared. The thought ignited something in me. I couldn't let him think that. I retrieved the slip of paper with his phone number, which I'd hidden in my jewelry box, a number he'd given me one afternoon after I'd commented on a rare plant in my garden that required special care. "If you need any help with it, just call me," he'd said. I knew it was an excuse, a way for us to stay connected now that our lunchtime chats had ended. That night, lying in bed beside my snoring husband, I realized I couldn't wait any longer. I had to see Ryan. I made a decision. I slipped out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and went downstairs into the living room. I took the piece of paper out of my jewelry box, my hands trembling as I dialed Ryan's number. "Hello?" Ryan's voice sounded groggy, tinged with confusion and concern. "It's me, Laura," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Ma'am, is everything okay?" he asked, his tone growing more alert. I gathered every ounce of courage I had left and murmured, "Could you come over for a moment? I want to talk." There was a long pause, and for a moment, I feared he would say no. But then, I heard him exhale softly. "All right. I'll be there in 10 minutes. I hung up the phone, my heart hammering violently. What was I doing? What if Richard woke up and found us? What if Ryan thought I was crazy? But I couldn't stop myself now. It was too late. I went to the living room and pulled out a dress I hadn't worn in years, a soft, flowing fabric that accentuated my figure. I glanced at myself in the mirror, smoothing my hair and flattening the wrinkles in my dress. I wasn't a young girl anymore, but tonight, I felt like I still had something to offer. I kept myself in shape, practiced yoga regularly, and I wasn't ashamed of my appearance. Not tonight. When the doorbell rang, I nearly jumped. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and saw Ryan standing there, looking nervous and slightly disheveled. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, his hair tousled from sleep. "Come in," I whispered, stepping aside. He hesitated, glancing around as if expecting someone to jump out and confront him. "My husband," I reassured him, "he's asleep. Don't worry. We won't wake him." He nodded slowly and stepped inside, his eyes darting around the dimly lit hallway. I led him into the living room, where he stood awkwardly by the door, his hands in his pockets. "Ryan," I said softly, interrupting his unease. "Call me Laura, please." "Laura," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, feeling my pulse race again. This wasn't like inviting him for lemonade in the garden. This was something entirely different. I stepped closer, and he tensed, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I just wanted to see you," I said gently. "It's been so long since we've talked, and I missed it." His eyes flicked up to meet mine, and I saw confusion there, uncertainty, but there was something else too, something that made my breath catch. Curiosity, perhaps? Or was it a reflection of my own desire? "I missed it too," he admitted, his voice barely audible. Those words sent a wave of warmth through me, and I took another step closer. Now, I was near enough to see the faint stubble on his jaw, the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. "Ryan," I whispered, reaching out to touch his arm. He flinched slightly at my touch, but didn't pull away. He was a young, sweet man who had brightened my days just by being near. He swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on my hand resting on his arm. I'm just doing my job, ma'am." "Ryan," I murmured, "have you ever been with a woman before?" His eyes widened, and I saw the answer on his face, before he even spoke. He shifted awkwardly, his cheeks flushing a deep red. There was a vulnerability in his eyes I hadn't seen in a long time, a mix of innocence and raw honesty, unhidden and unguarded. I mean, he stammered, looking down at the floor. I haven't, not really. Something inside me softened, a pang of tenderness spreading through my chest. He was so young, so inexperienced, and here I was standing in front of him like a temptress from a fairy tale, offering him something he probably hadn't even dared to dream of. Ryan, I murmured, reaching for him again. He looked up, his eyes wide and uncertain, filled with worry. It's okay, I said, my voice soothing. I just want you to feel comfortable. If you want to leave, I understand. He swallowed, his throat bobbing visibly, but instead of stepping back, he shook his head, slowly. No, he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. I don't want to leave. My heart fluttered, and I gave him a gentle, reassuring smile, stepping back just slightly to give him more space. I could feel his nervous energy, the way he seemed braced for something unexpected. He looked so out of place in the softly lit room, like a lost boy rather than the strong, capable man I had admired for weeks. Let's sit down and talk for a bit, I suggested softly, gesturing toward the small sofa by the window. There's no need to rush anything. I just want to get to know you better. He nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. We moved to the sofa, and I sat down first, smoothing my dress over my knees. He followed, sitting on the edge of the cushion, his posture still stiff. Tell me, I began gently, turning to face him, what do you do when you're not tending to gardens? Time seemed to blur as we talked. I watched the tension slowly ebb from him, the way his shoulders relaxed and his smile became more genuine. There was a light in his eyes now, a sparkle I hadn't seen before. And as the conversation flowed, I noticed the way his gaze kept drifting toward me, toward the neckline of my dress. He would glance, quickly, then look away, just as fast, his cheeks darkening with embarrassment. It was, in some strange way, endearing, this big, strong young man suddenly reduced to a nervous boy unsure of where to look. Ryan, I said softly, drawing his eyes back to mine. Do you find me attractive? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and disbelief. I. He struggled to find the words, his throat working furiously as he tried to form a coherent response. Finally, he gave up and nodded, his face flushing deeply. Yes, he whispered, barely audible. A blush spread across me as well at his admission, and I felt a sudden surge of courage. I leaned in closer to him. Thank you, I whispered, my voice soft and sincere. I think you're very handsome too. He blinked, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then, slowly and cautiously, he raised his hand and took mine, his fingers calloused and strong. Laura, His eyes searched mine for something, reassurance, permission. I'm not sure. I don't want to do anything wrong. My heart softened at his words, and I gently squeezed his hand. You're not doing anything wrong, Ryan, I promised. I just want you to feel comfortable. His gaze dropped to where our hands were intertwined, and I saw how tightly his fingers clung to mine as if holding on for dear life. I've never felt like this before, he admitted, his voice raw with vulnerability. His confession took me by surprise, and I felt an ache deep within me, something unfamiliar yet profound. This wasn't just an older woman seeking the thrill of being with someone younger. I was needed. And in that moment, I realized that perhaps he needed me just as much as I needed him. Then, I found myself leaning closer, feeling the connection between us grow stronger. He stiffened, his breath catching in his throat, but then slowly, he began to respond. I pulled back just slightly. Is this okay? I whispered. He nodded, his eyes darkening with an emotion I couldn't fully decipher. It's right, he breathed. Please don't stop. So, I didn't. He trembled, his hands hovering uncertainly at his sides before he finally, cautiously, wrapped his arms around me. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into eternity as we explored one another, the tension that had simmered between us for so long finally melting away, replaced by something untamed. "I've wanted this for so long," I admitted softly, "but I never knew if you felt the same." "I did," he murmured, his voice rough and honest. "I didn't think you'd ever look at me like this." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Oh, I did," I whispered. "And I want to show you, if you're willing." He swallowed, glancing at me with a mixture of shyness and resolve, then nodded, slowly. "I am," he said quietly, his voice filled with a sincerity that made my heart flutter. With a gentle smile, I took his hand and led him toward the couch. It felt almost unreal, as if time had frozen and the world around us had disappeared. He looked down at me, his expression one of both determination and restraint. "It's okay, Ryan," I whispered, keeping my voice calm and soft. "Have you ever done this before?" I asked gently, not wanting to overwhelm him. He seemed far more vulnerable now, standing here in my dimly lit living room. He shook his head slowly, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "No, not like this." His gaze burned into mine, and then, as though some invisible barrier had finally been broken, I slowly guided him, taking my time to make him feel at ease. As he looked at me, his eyes wide and full of trust, there was a sweetness to his hesitation, a tenderness that made me want to hold him tightly and tell him everything was going to be all right. "Just follow my lead," I murmured. We moved together, slowly exploring, learning each other's rhythm. The entire experience felt like unearthing a new discovery, a secret shared only between the two of us. He was a quick learner, his confidence growing with each small success. And when he finally let go of his reservations, when he surrendered to the emotion stirring within him, it was like witnessing a dam break, a flood of passion and intensity taking its place. "Laura," he breathed, his voice hoarse and filled with wonder. "I never thought." "Neither did I whispered back, and yet here we were. The night stretched endlessly, each moment blurring into the next. We lost ourselves in each other, our movements slow and deliberate. And when it was over, when we finally lay side by side, I felt a strange sense of contentment wash over me. I turned my head to look at him, my chest tightening at the sight of his flushed face and the faint, wistful smile on his lips. But as much as I wanted to stay in that moment, reality began creeping back in. The clock on the bedside table told me it was late, too late, and far too risky. I couldn't afford for my husband to wake up and find Ryan here. As much as I cared for him, as much as I wanted to savor this newfound connection, I knew we had to be careful. With a reluctant sigh, I shifted, propping myself up to look at him. "Ryan," I said softly, "I think you should go." He stared at me for a long moment, and then, with a faint, resigned smile, he nodded. "All right. I understand." We slowly disentangled ourselves, each movement hesitant and reluctant. When he was finally ready, I walked him to the back door, our footsteps light and quiet. He turned to look at me one last time, his eyes soft and full of unspoken words. "Thank you, Laura," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything." I smiled gently. "No, Ryan. Thank you, for making me feel alive again." With that, I gently nudged him out the door, watching as he disappeared into the night. I closed the door softly and stood there for a moment, my mind buzzing with a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, relief, exhilaration. But there was also a strange sense of calm that settled over me. For the first time in years, I felt a renewed sense of energy and purpose, as though a part of me that had lain dormant had been awakened. It was, of course, wrong. But I couldn't deny the satisfaction I felt. With light steps, I returned to the bedroom and slipped under the covers, beside my husband. He was still fast asleep, his face calm and undisturbed. I glanced at him, the familiar feeling of love for him settling in. But now, it felt different, distant, almost. I still cared for him deeply, but I had given a part of myself to someone else. Tonight. Turning onto my side, I stared up at the ceiling. The house was silent, but my mind was anything but. Thoughts of Ryan lingered, of how gentle he'd been, his uncertainty yet eagerness. Curling up under the blankets, I closed my eyes and let the emotions wash over me. I knew what I had done was a betrayal, a secret I would have to carry alone. But I also knew, in some inexplicable way, that it had made me feel more connected to myself than I had in a long time. With a soft sigh, I allowed myself to drift to sleep, a faint smile on my lips. I didn't know what the future would hold or whether I would ever dare to face Ryan in that way again. But for now, I was content. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of life burning within me. And for better or worse, that was enough.